Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing? Thank you for standing by. We're having a couple of technical difficulties, but I think we're on the way. So what we're going to talk about here is new features in 2D in Unity. I'm Russ Scammell. I'm the product manager for 2D at Unity. But I want to find out more about you. Who in the audience is an artist? Any artists in the room? You can hold your hands up proud, high and proud, if you're an artist. Cool. How many artists in the room that call themselves designers? Any designers in the room? Cool, there we go. And coders, well represented, I'm assuming? Oh, and who is everyone else? Audio engineers, I knew it. Okay, cool. So what I want to talk about is a couple of different things that we've been working on in 2D. We're going to demo some of them, and we're going to have slides for the rest. So let's start with foundations, as we saw in the keynote. With 2D, it's very important that we have a strong foundation, because we build everything else on top of that, and a lot of our 2D users are quite happy with just using the foundational layer, so we want to make sure that that is supported really well. So one of the big additions we made this year was Sprite Atlas APIs. So if you are using the Sprite Atlas asset and you want more control over when and how you build those atlases, there is now an API behind that. So you can create and add and build those Sprite atlases as you need to in your pipeline. For the Sprite renderer, we added a really crucial piece, which is this concept of sorting by pivot, right? So pivot sorting. Very often you'll have your sprites in your scene, your sprite renderers are in your scene, and you want the pivot to be offset somewhere, right? Not in the center. And then when you're doing sorting, you want to make sure that sorting respects that pivot position and not just the center of the sprite. So this is something that we've added this year, right, to 2D. Cool. So moving on to world building. So in world building, we've added 2 world building tools, and one of them has two extra parts. So we've got hexagonal tile maps. So what we've got with hexagonal tile maps, how many of you have used the tile maps in Unity? Can I get a show of hands? Some tile map users in the room? Okay, cool. So hex tile maps are mainly used in kind of your strategic tabletop type games because the shape makes it ideal to kind of, build out that kind of tactical play area. And for 2D, we've added both the point top and flat top variations. So these are just options when you create a tile. So if we look at these kind of things, right? So you can create stuff like that. So even though that might look 3D, that's actually multi-layered hexagonal tile maps placed within a hex grid with a little bit of spacing between the cells. And with 2018.3, isometric tiles. So the idea here is that we have kind of same size on all axes, or really kind of characterized by having this same length, or this kind of isometric projection. Again, very popular in a lot of games, right? A lot of 2D games that you see in the market are built essentially in ISO. We've also added, so there's 2 types of isometric. The idea being that you can either paint Z as Y, where you have control over placing the tiles at different heights, but by painting on the same part of the tile map. Or just regular Z, where you select what kind of Z, what kind of position you want to paint to, and you can have. On a single tile map layer, you can have multiple tiles per cell, right? Because you're putting them on the Z axis. Cool. Okay, so we also introduced sprite shape. So the idea here is to address the kind of organic world building market, right? Where people are trying to build worlds that are not just on a grid, not hex or ISO or rectangular, but more freeform, right? So something like this. And the idea here is to tile the sprites along the shape. So you can see, for example, the sprite shape here is this rocky ground with the grass along the top. And what we've got there is a sprite that's been tiled along the top, and then another sprite, another texture that's been tiled as a fill. Okay, and we basically use Bezier splines, and then you can switch sprites accordingly based on angle ranges, and we can determine kind of which sprite to render based on that. So there's a lot to process there. There's a lot going on in sprite shape. So this is a good candidate for a demo. We're going to jump into Unity now and take a look at how this works. We're going to cover what a sprite shape profile is, what are angle ranges, what's the sprite shape controller, how do we do a corner in sprite shapes. We're going to look at sprite borders, but also just generally an example to do with platforms and how you'd make a platformer. Okay. So let's get into Unity. Okay, so let's start with a simpler example than this. Okay, save, yeah. So let's say I want to build a sprite shape from scratch, right? Can everyone see that? Cool, I'll zoom in a bit from time to time. So the first thing you want to do is create one of these, right? This is a sprite shape profile, and you make it via the create menu. There we are, right, sprite shape profile. And the one I've got here is already somewhat set up. Just want to show you how we've set it up. So a sprite shape profile is a way of defining angle ranges and then assigning sprites to those angle ranges. So here we've got the angle range selector. So I'm going to zoom in a bit here so you can see how we've set this up. This is our angle range selector, and based on what it really tells you is that based on this normal on the shape, we're going to render this sprite. And then when we go to these normals down here, if it's facing down, we're going to render this sprite. Okay? And then where we've got the texture, the fill texture, we're going to fill everything that's inside this sprite shape. So that's what we call a closed sprite shape. Or in the sense of, we'll see later, you can do open sprite shapes as well, where we don't use the fill. So I've defined this, and the way I defined it is per angle range, down here, we have a sprite, right? We can add more than one sprite. I'm going to show you how to do that later, but for now, we've got grass outline and orange outline. Okay, so far so good. So then I take one of these, and I drag it into the scene. Okay? And what we have now is a spline, right, that I can play with. And every time I've got verts I've got a segment that is pointing down like this, I can get that particular, the angle range that was pointing down, we're going to display that sprite. And then when it's pointing up, we're going to display the grass sprite. Okay? Now we can, of course, change these control points, right? We can change them to something else. Let's go in here, change that one. Change that one. So you can see this becomes quite a fun kind of organic tool for building levels, right? I can come in here and just add extra stuff, right? That's kind of fun. Cool. So let's take another look a little bit deeper. So you know how to set up a basic sprite shape. What if you wanted to set up a sprite shape that had kind of hard edges? And what does that mean? So let's take a look at this example here. Okay? So this looks like you'd build it with a tile system, right? Like a tile map or something. But this is a sprite shape. And the difference here is that we have defined corners. So there are corner sprites to cover each of the corner cases. Bit of a joke there. Oh, software update, no thanks. Okay. So let's take a look. Let's see how this sprite shape was constructed. Let's look at the castle wall profile. And again, we're going to zoom in here. So here you can see we've got the same thing. We've got more than 2 ranges now, right? And we can define these. We can change all of this stuff, add our own later if we wanted to. But we've also got corners, right? So these are individual sprites defined for top, left, top right, bottom left, bottom right, inner, outer. Right, variants of all of that. So why would you want to do this? Maybe you want something like this. You want a shape made up of straight edges, but you don't necessarily want them to be axis aligned. So maybe you want to do something like this, right? So it's a little bit cool, a little bit more funky. Oop, broke it. Let me zoom out a bit here. There we go. Maybe I want to do the door a little bit like this. So you can see it's still kind of made up. It's an organic kind of shape, but made up of hard edges, right? And we can skew the corners to make them look a little bit more interesting. So you can make those kind of funky, zany looking levels. Sweet. Okay, now let's look at applying sprite shapes to, say, a platformer, right? And what are the different problems that you would face when you're thinking about putting together a platformer? Okay, so let's open up this. Don't save. By the way, if you're interested in sprite shapes and you want to see this plus a little bit of scripting on how to use sprite shapes, I'm doing another session later at 2 o'clock where I dig in a little bit deeper. Okay, so here we go. We're going to make a platformer. So we've made this sprite shape here. Let's take a look at the profile. You can see it's got grass at the top, rocks at the bottom. Okay, so far so good. But what's up with these edges, right? They're kind of looking a bit, not really what I wanted, yeah? And let me just mess about with this a little bit. Yeah, that's what I wanted. So we've kind of got the rocks rendering in the wrong order. We've got the grass on the top. What I want is I want the grass rendering over the rocks at all the time. And I want some softer edges here, because this looks broken, right? This looks like someone sliced a piece off the edge of this grass, which is exactly what happened. So let's take a look at the grass and rocks, and let's look at the grass top sprite. And then let's dig into how it's actually set up. So if we look at the grass top sprite, look at the sprite editor, we can see there are actually slices in here, right? So we've defined borders for this sprite, but we're just not using them at the moment, okay? So we want to turn that on. So the center piece of that sprite is tiling, and then it's got these nice cap pieces. Okay, so let's go to the grass and rocks, and let's make sure that under control points here, we use sprite borders. Okay, that already looks better. Cool. Now, I want these rocks to render behind, to be drawn behind the grass. So another thing I want to look at here is the order. So for each angle range, you can define a start and end angle, but you can also define the order in which to render it. So what I want to do is I want the rocks to be order 0, so they get drawn first, and then I want the grass to be drawn second on top of that. So grass should be order 1. Okay, and because my grass texture has a little alpha shadow in it, it kind of looks cool here. It looks like it's kind of building a drop shadow on top of the rocks. Yeah, sweet. So next up, let's expose a couple of other platforms. So I want to kind of talk about what you might be trying to do when you're building a platformer. You probably want to make reusable parts, right? So you want to be able to build these reusable parts and then assemble them into all these interesting shapes. Maybe you're building an endless runner, so you want to stream these in as you go. And so we've included a couple of little sub-features that are useful for this kind of thing. So first of all, you may notice that this edge here does not have nothing is being drawn there, right? And the way we did that is by making it possible for you to have a null variant. More on that later, I'll come back to it. But this is by design. Now, I have broken this one deliberately to show you another feature that we have that will help you kind of align these pieces. Small but useful. If you're editing the spline, you can turn on snapping. So here we're looking at some snapping. So that if you want to move these shapes around, you can kind of go, okay, I want that to snap exactly there, and I want that to snap right there. And then now these two pieces look like they fit, or do they? We're still not done. We've still got a seam there. So that's not so cool. What else can we do? So the other thing that we can adjust here is we can pick up the, go to the sprite shape profile itself and turn on world space UVs, right? So if we look at the seam here, I'm going to turn on the world space UVs over here, and we can see that seam just goes away, right? And that's because we are now tiling this fill based on world space coordinates. Okay. So let's talk about variants. So when you've got a grass strip like this, it's nice to break it up in the game so that it's not so, monotonous. It's not just one piece. You can, of course, put other game objects on that as well. That's kind of fun. You could do that. Or you could, if the variants are minor, you might want to add them into the sprite shape itself. So here, I want to show you we've got grass top with small rocks, grass top with flowers, and as I click here, we can actually see what those variations look like, right? So they're minor variations on the theme, and we want to apply those to that particular angle range. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to click on one of these nodes, one of these control points, and then what I can do is I can change the sprite index, right? So the sprite index will read into the sprite shape profile and get the appropriate variant. So there you go. That's a little bit more interesting. Let's click out of this, go in here. I want to change this one. Let's put in some flowers. Cool. There we go. Okay, so as you can see, we've added a lot of different variations. These are reusable parts that can snap together. We've got world space UVs, so that the tiling is going to work. And we can add variants, so there's a little bit more visual interest going on. Nice. Now you may have noticed while I was doing all of this, I often forget to mention this part, I've got a polygon collider 2D down here, right? And as I move things around, that's just updating as I go. And that's because you can just attach a polygon collider 2D to a sprite shape, check update collider here, and we're going to make sure that your collider will keep in sync with whatever changes you're making to the sprite shape, right? So this is not just a visual tool. You can immediately get in there and start making stuff that would interact with your gameplay, right? Sweet. Okay, so we've seen general sprite shapes. Let's take a look at what happens if I don't want to use the fill at all, or what we refer to as open sprite shapes. So you can do some pretty funky stuff, right? So here we've got a sprite shape where we've gone to each of the height, each of the control points, and we've played around with the height. So that's something you can do. Whee! That's kind of fun. You can also, this is very important, you can also turn off the fill, which is this open-ended checkbox here, right? So if I turn that on, it closes it, but I haven't defined a texture fill, so that's why there's no texture fill being drawn here, right? So it ends up being a strip, yeah? Nice. Okay. And you can also just use the fill. Okay, so let's take a look at this sprite shape profile, right? This one over here. So all I've got here is a texture fill, just one tiny little blue texture, and no angle ranges, and no sprites, right? So what would I use that for? So I can come in here and I can create all these kind of cool trees, right? They're all sprite shapes. I've duplicated them around the level. And there you go. So everything that we see up here has been made with sprite shape, right? In its different forms. So one with the level itself with the edges and the fill and the different variants. And then we just use the edge to create that kind of flourish on the right. And we can fill up the background, in this case, with something that looks like just a bunch of trees fogging into the distance. So that's sprite shape. Nice. Okay, back to slides. Cool. Let's look at the world of animation in 2D. Just give me a second here. So earlier this year, we released 2D animation phase 1, and the idea there was the rigging of a single sprite. We developed a bunch of features and workflows around that. We released that in the forums. A lot of you were very, very engaged. You came into the forums, you spoke to us, told us what you needed, and that informed the development of phase 2. Which is built on top of what we designed in phase 1, but with a clearer focus on efficient creation of characters that are built of multiple sprites or multiple pieces, and also workflows for larger productions. For example, the iteration loop that is there in phase 2 is a lot tighter than it used to be in phase 1. So when we talk about sprite rigging, when we talk about the 2D animation package, we're talking about sprite rigging, which is this process, right? Of bringing in a sprite, editing those bones, adding them. I'll show you a little bit about how that works in the editor. And you want to tessellate the mesh, because very often, if you've come from the world of 3D, you already have a mesh. But in 2D, how are you going to slice up your sprite? In what way should it be articulated or sliced or tessellated so that it can deform correctly? And then you want to paint weights, right? You want to be able to kind of build that relationship between the bones and the vertices on that sprite so that you know, okay, if I move this bone, how will it deform? Which vertices are under its control? And as you go, you want to preview all the time, because it's a refinement process, right? You'll get there in stages. So let's look at the parts that make up the sprite rigging workflow for version 2. So we redid the editor window for this. So it is now all combined in a single window where you do everything. So this is the skinning editor module, which is part of the sprite editor window. And we've divided the tools up into kind of skeleton or bone tools, mesh tools, and weight painting. Right? And a lot of this stuff includes automatic options for doing many of these things. I'll show some stuff in the editor. We're not going to do a full rigging and animation, but I'll just poke around in the editor to show you where things are and kind of how we've been thinking about this problem. Now, when you drag it into the scene, you need to add a sprite skin, or in the case of multi-sprite characters, that gets added automatically, which essentially is that thing that binds the bone transforms to the sprite in the scene. This is the thing that you animate. You animate all of the transforms, and this is the thing that connects them. Sorry. We'll come to that later. Okay, so let's jump into animation. All right. So I'm just going to kind of tour you through the sections. This character hasn't been rigged up properly, so we're going to just talk about the different things that you have over here. So if we had this rig set up and you move these bones around, you're basically doing what's called a preview pose, which allows you to jump in here and kind of move all these bones around, right? You may also, when you're creating a character, you may want to edit joints. So you can come into the joints themselves and do this, right? Which is a little bit more intuitive if you're trying to place bones over a character. You can, of course, create bones. Right, so you can just click through and just make a bunch of bones. Whee! That's kind of fun. Or you can refine the bones that you already have. Right, so maybe you realize you need a little bit more control. You need one extra joint in there. You can just click in and add in those joints. Now I realize that I've jumped forward a little bit here because I wanted to talk about this character that we're seeing on screen. This is not a single sprite. Right, this is a multi-part sprite. And what this is a Photoshop PSB that we have imported. And I want to show you the different bits here. So in the PSB importer, you can see that you can import multi-layered PSD files into Unity. And in this case, there's a few settings to help you deal with what you've got in terms of data, right, from your artist. So very often when you get one of these Photoshop files, there's a bunch of layers in the instruction, right? You kind of use them to assemble the character, but you don't really want them to come into Unity. So you can, we by default have import hidden turned off so that you don't get all of those hidden layers. We have a mosaic checkbox, which means that the layers will be imported as individual sprites. Character rigging, which basically sets it up to support all of these character rigging workflows. And use hierarchy, which means if you've got a hierarchy of layers in Photoshop, we can respect that when you import it into Unity. So you can kind of define a little bit of your character's hierarchy in Photoshop before you bring it in. Cool. So what does it actually look like when it comes in, right? It looks like that, right? That's how it got imported. The character in Photoshop is actually like this on multiple layers, right? As we bring it into Unity, we build this sprite sheet, which is exploded out so that you can see where all the different parts are. This can be useful when you want to know which bones belong to which section. You want to have a little bit more of an understanding of that. Cool. So let's keep going. You can, of course, get in there and kind of generate geometry for each of these parts. You can set up vertices, edges, you can split edges, you can define a lot of these parts yourself. You can also go in there and do auto weight painting across everything, so there's a lot of automatic steps here. And you can do that either via sliders if you want more kind of fine numerical control over everything, or you can, if you want a kind of an expressive control, we have weight painting brushes that you can use to kind of paint, smooth out or paint or apply or subtract weights, the connection between the bones and those vertices. Cool. There's a bunch of visibility tools here as well. So if you want to come in here and turn parts of the sprite off and on, like you want to come in here and you want to turn off like the hair, for example, you can do that. So that you can hide parts of the sprite so that you can go in and actually work on one area, just isolate that, and then slowly work through your character. And there are, of course, controls here to hide and to kind of turn on and turn off visibility of bones and sprites. Cool. Okay, so that's animation. That's what the animation tooling looks like. We are probably a couple of weeks, 2 weeks or so from releasing this as V2. And you'll be able to get it like you get all of our preview packages via the Package Manager UI. More on that later. And we're back in PowerPoint. Okay, oh, we've seen all of this. Okay, so let's switch gears. Let's talk about graphics, right? There's a bunch of interesting graphics things that you want to think about when you're doing 2D. And for all of the pixel art aficionados in the room, everyone making those really cool retro throwback games, there's a lot of this in the world. And it's especially difficult when you're trying to make them on the wide range of devices that people play them on nowadays. So Pixel Perfect Camera is the solution to this. Basically, the concept of Pixel Perfect is this idea that you get imperfections or kind of tearing or broken alignment in your pixel art when you kind of render it to a non-integer native resolution, right? So that's the problem. So what have people been doing? They've been building their own scripts. They've been doing a lot of stuff. We've kind of combined all of these concepts in one Pixel Perfect Camera package, which allows you to set up a reference resolution, kind of talk about what size you're going for, and then kind of solve this problem, make it work for you, which is cool. A couple of things to keep in mind. So this is a good part to talk about best practices in the usage of this. So it does take care of all the calculations for you, but you need to do a little bit of setup to make sure that your pixel art is designed right and is starting in the right place. Okay, so let's look at some best practices. So first of all, you want to look at your pixels per unit. probably a good idea that all your sprites have the same pixels per unit. It is possible to get things to work if your pixels per unit are integer multipliers of a base pixel per unit reference value. But let's just say keep them the same, right, for basic application. You want to set filter mode to point, because that's going to help you out, right? You don't have all of that bleeding. Compression to none is a good idea as well. In the sprite editor, we've added a pivot unit mode so that you can set up the pivot for each of your sprite elements to be we've added a pivot unit mode for pixels, right? So you can have your pivot on a pixel, right? So that's a really good thing to have when you're trying to stay pixel perfect. When you start up, you want to make sure all of your existing game objects are on a pixel grid, if you can think about it that way. So what is your pixel grid? Your pixel grid in Unity is going to be something you can set up in snap settings, right? So if you know your PPU, you know your per pixel, you know your pixels per unit, you want to go into your snap settings and set your move X, Y, and Z to 1 divided by this PPU, right? And then you can just apply this across the board and everything will be in its right place. And then from that point onwards, the pixel perfect camera will take care of all of the calculations for you. Keep it on that grid. Awesome. Last thing I want to talk about is 2D lights and shadows. We saw a bit of this in the keynote earlier, but it's worth talking about again. So the idea here is to create a 2D lights and shadows system that solves a couple of things, right? First of all, a lot of 2D games are running on fairly low-end devices, so we want to make sure that one aspect of these lights is that they are fast and mobile-friendly. So these lights are going to be shape-based lights that don't have any directional information, but that you can use to add kind of mood and color and tone to your games. And then another set of lights, 2D point and spotlights, and in this case they do have directional information, possibly drawing from masks or normals and things like this that you can apply as secondary textures to the sprites that will be affected by this. And that we will see later on. And shadows, right? And whatever that means for 2D, we're going to see more of that as we start developing through this. So in fairly early stages of 2D lights and shadows, but I thought it would be nice that everyone had a look at a quick preview of what that looks like. So here are some art assets by the awesome Kenny. So all laid out in a platformer, and then what we've done is we've added some 2D shape lights. We're going to play that again. There we go. So we can see here it's all kind of flat lit, right? There's no kind of variation there. And then here we've got those searchlight beams. Those are shape lights that are rotating. And then around each of those floating aliens, we've got yellow lights that are kind of blending against the background. A couple of things I want you to notice is that the yellow lights are not actually lighting the background, for example, right? So you can have kind of culling between the lights and the background, so you have some control over how these lights affect your scene. Cool. So we've come to the end of the current crop of 2D features, 2D updates, but this is very important. What can you do? So I always like to bring it back to our users. Because we're really trying to deliver tools that are supporting the way you work and the kind of the dreams and the projects that we've seen from you. So please try out the latest preview packages, visit the forums, and tell us how what are you working on, what are your workflows, where are we holding you back, and where are we helping you? And tell us what works as expected, because sometimes if it works as expected, it's crickets, which is cool, right? It's silence, which is good. That means it's working. But sometimes it's nice to know. What doesn't work, you are already doing that, and that's awesome. Keep doing it. Tell us more. We all know what's missing and what could be better, of course, right? And of course, keep making amazing 2D experiences in Unity. So thank you very much. One more thing. So we've got the Unity 2D Challenge up. Those of you who have not heard about this, it's a really good chance. Still running strong. We've got about 60 entries so far. I think your odds are good. There's some really good ones, but There are some in there that I'm sure you can beat. I want to see more competition on this. It's a really fun chance to try out the new 2D tools. So go to connectunity.com, challenges/challenges/2D challenge. And the idea here is to use those new 2D tools, the new packages. Let's get playful, right? Let's try something out. Let's show the people what we've got. And for all of the packages that you've seen today, just in case you don't know how to get them, this is what you do, right? So all of these are available as preview packages. Get the latest beta from the website. Install them from the package manager, right? So it's really easy. Window package manager. You want to show preview packages. That's really important. Otherwise, they won't show up. And then because they're awesome 2D packages, they're right at the top of the list because, yay, alphabetical order. So you can get 2D animation, 2D IK, 2D pixel perfect, 2D sprite shape, try them all out. And if you want more fun stuff to play with, especially if you're into tile maps, drop in at the GitHub Unity Technologies/2D extras. We've got lots of examples of how you can write custom brushes, custom scripts for tile maps and things like that. Awesome. Thank you very much.